She had learned to read a folded flag before she learned to read a map, not metaphorically, literally. Dorothy Mae Whitfield had grown up in a house where the flag from her grandfather's funeral sat in a triangular case on the mantel beside the television, and she had spent years as a child watching the way the light moved across the glass case at different times of day, the way the stars caught the afternoon sun through the living room window, the way her grandmother's eyes moved to the case each morning when she came downstairs, the way the case was never dusted with anything less than a cloth kept specifically for that purpose. She had learned what the flag meant before she had learned what the words on the base of the case said. She understood it the way you understand things that are present before you have language for them completely in the bones before the explanation arrives. She had married a soldier. Calvin James Whitfield was 23 years old and a private first class in the United States Army when Dorothy Elaine Harper, 22, recently graduated from Columbus State University with a degree in library science, currently employed as a library assistant at Muskogee County School District, met him at a church social at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Columbus, Georgia, 16 miles from the gates of Fort Benning. He was tall and quiet and wore his uniform on Sunday because his civilian clothes were still at his mother's house in Macon, and he had not yet acquired what he called a civilian wardrobe appropriate to the situation, by which he meant that he had not yet found the time to shop, which was a thing he was not good at, and which he acknowledged openly and without self-consciousness, which was the first thing Dorothy had noticed about him, the particular quality of his honesty. She had noticed it, and then she had spent 5 minutes talking to him about library acquisitions policy and the collection development challenges facing school district libraries in underfunded regions, which was not a typical first conversation topic, and Calvin Whitfield had listened with the specific focused attention of someone who is genuinely interested in what you are saying, rather than the attention of someone who is waiting for you to stop so that they can say the thing they had planned to say. He had asked 2 questions. Both of them were good questions. She had thought, I would like to speak with this person again. She had. They were married 3 years later in the same church where they had met with a reception in the fellowship hall that had been organized primarily by Calvin's mother, who was a woman with strong organizational opinions and no hesitation about applying them, and which Dorothy had navigated with the particular patience she had developed for well-intentioned authority, which was to say complete cooperation on the things that did not matter and complete firmness on the things that did. Calvin had laughed at her description of this approach. He had said, that is exactly how you navigate the Army. She had said, I know, I've been watching. She had been watching since before Calvin. She had been watching since the flag case on her grandmother's mantel in Macon, Georgia, where she had grown up in a house where military service was not an abstraction, but a fact woven into the family's understanding of itself. Her grandfather, James Harper, had served in the Army in Korea, 8th Army, 1950 to 1952, 2 years that he had described in her hearing, only once, briefly, to her grandmother in a conversation Dorothy had not been intended to hear, and had heard anyway, standing in the kitchen doorway at 7 years old, understanding that the words he was saying were not words that required her presence, and not moving because she understood also that the conversation was one of the most important ones she had encountered. Her grandfather had come home from Korea and not spoken about it again in her presence, but the flag case on the mantel had spoken about it every morning of her childhood, in the specific language of objects that carry meaning, quietly, consistently, without elaboration. Her uncle Roderick Harper had served in Vietnam. He had come home in 1968 with a shoulder wound that had healed and a quality about him that had not healed in the same way which Dorothy had learned to read the way children learn to read the specific qualities of adults around them carefully and mostly correctly. Roderick was her grandmother's favorite and had been her grandmother's worry for the 3 years he was gone, and when he came back and sat in the kitchen at the family table, her grandmother had looked at him for a long time, and then said, "You're here." Roderick had said, "I'm here." They had not said anything else about it. and Dorothy, 11 years old at the time, watching from across the table with the concentrated attention she brought to everything that seemed to matter, had understood that "I'm here" was a complete and sufficient sentence in the context in which it was spoken. She had grown up understanding that service was what some men in her family did, and that what they came home carrying was theirs and not to be demanded from them, and that the right response to a returned soldier was presence rather than interrogation. She had carried this understanding to her marriage with Calvin, and to the 36 years of the marriage, and to the moment 11 months ago when the paramedics had said what they had to say in the hospital waiting room, and she had understood that he was not going to come home from this one. He had been in the Army for 6 years by then. She had spent 3 of those years learning the specific language of military life, the rank structure, the deployment schedules, the unwritten codes of post life, the way a unit's mood traveled from the soldier to the household in the evening, the way that the particular weight a man carried from the work of the day was different from the weight carried by men in other kinds of work, denser and harder to set down at the door. She had learned the hierarchy of priorities on a military post and the specific protocols of military social life and the unspoken codes about when you spoke and when you did not, and what subjects required discretion and what required directness. She had learned all of this not through formal instruction, but through the specific education of paying attention in a new environment until the environment's logic became her own. The military world had its own grammar. She had become fluent. She had not set the weight down at the door either. She had learned to carry her portion of it because that was what partnership meant in the context of this specific life, and she had chosen the life with full awareness of what it contained. She had chosen it knowing the deployments would come, and the weight would be distributed unevenly, and the years would pass in ways that civilian life did not pass faster. In some respects, slower in others, punctuated by the specific rhythms of service rather than the rhythms of a life organized around its own preferences. She had chosen it knowing that the man she had married would belong in some portion of himself that she could share but not claim to something larger than their marriage, and she had found across 41 years that this was not a diminishment, but an addition, that the portion of Calvin that belonged to the Army was not separate from the Calvin she had married, but inseparable from him, and that the man he had become across 28 years of service was the man she had grown alongside, and that she would not have chosen a different version of either of them. Calvin Whitfield served for 28 years. He made Master Sergeant, which is E8, which is the second highest enlisted rank in the United States Army, which is reached by approximately 4% of soldiers who enter service, and requires a combination of time performance evaluations, selection, board consideration, and the specific quality of sustained excellence in both technical competence and leadership that boards are looking for, and which Calvin Whitfield had demonstrated consistently enough across 28 years that the board had selected him once for Staff Sergeant and once for Master Sergeant without question and ahead of peers who had been waiting longer. He served in Panama in 1989 during Operation Just Cause. He was 24 years old and a sergeant by then, and what he came home from Panama with, besides the Army Commendation Medal that was his first decoration awarded for actions during the clearing of a sector of Panama City, was the understanding that the training the Army had given him was real. He had said this to Dorothy once, years later, in one of the conversations, where he told her a specific thing rather than a general thing. The training was real. He had said it with the quality of a man who had been surprised by something he should have known and was acknowledging the surprise honestly. She had said, "What did you expect?" He had said, "You train hoping it works. You find out in Panama whether it works." She had said, "And it worked." He had said it worked. She had said, "Then what did you come home with?" He had thought about that for a moment. He had said, "I came home with the knowledge that the men on my left and right knew what they were doing, and that I knew what I was doing. That is the thing you go looking for and don't know whether you'll find until you find it." She had thought about that for a long time. He served in the Gulf War in 1991. He was a staff sergeant by then, leading a 10-man infantry squad in the 24th Infantry Division during the ground campaign, the 100 hours that had moved from the Saudi border through southern Iraq. His squad had engaged in 2 significant actions over those 100 hours, both of which were documented in the after-action reports filed by his company commander, and both of which contributed to the Bronze Star with Valor that was awarded 6 months later at a ceremony at Fort Stewart. The Valor Device, the small letter VIVE attached to the ribbon, indicated that the award was for actions in direct combat with an enemy force, which meant something specific in the taxonomy of military decorations. It meant he had been there, and he had done the specific thing the situation required under fire with his unit depending on the decision. He had received the Bronze Star at a ceremony Dorothy had attended. She had watched the colonel pin it to his chest. She had looked at Calvin's face during the pinning, and she had seen the expression of a man who is receiving formal acknowledgement of something he does not quite know how to hold, and she had thought he is not sure he deserved it more than the men who were beside him. She had known this about him before the Gulf War, and had had it confirmed by this moment. The decorations were always for Calvin connected to the people who had been in the same situation with him, and the decoration's weight was distributed in his mind among all of them, not concentrated on the individual who wore it. He served 2 tours in Iraq, the first beginning in 2003, the second in 2005. He came home from the second Iraq tour in 2006. He never talked about what he had done in the specific sense of combat narration. He talked about the people, the soldiers in his unit, the ones he had been responsible for, the ones who had been injured, the ones who had not come home. He talked about them the way he talked about everything he cared about, with the specificity of someone who has paid close attention, and with the economy of someone who knows that the precise detail carries more weight than the general statement. He talked about Staff Sergeant Paul Okafor, who had been wounded in Fallujah in 2004, and who had recovered, and who Calvin had called every year at Christmas for the rest of his life, and whom Dorothy had met twice at unit reunions, and who had hugged Calvin in the particular way that men who have been through something together hug each other briefly, firmly, with complete understanding of what the hug contains. He talked about Corporal Marcus Webb, not the same Marcus Webb, different man, different generation, who had been 20 years old and from Shreveport, and who had gotten home from both tours, and who Calvin heard had become a teacher in Louisiana, which Calvin had said was exactly right, because the specific quality of attention Marcus had brought to everything in their unit was the quality you needed in front of a classroom. He had talked about the ones who had not come home in a different register, carefully, specifically, with the names said clearly, and the particular facts of their lives, where they were from, whether they had children, what they had been working toward given the weight those facts were owed. He retired in 2008 after 28 years. Dorothy had been with him the day he handed in the last of the paperwork. She had driven him to the installation and waited in the car while he went in, and when he came out, he was in civilian clothes. He had changed before coming out, which was a thing she had not known he planned to do, and which had surprised her when the door opened and he was in khakis and a polo shirt. And she had looked at him in the parking lot in the morning light, and she had thought, this is who he is now. Not different from who he was. The same man in different clothes, with 28 years of service completed, and a house in Columbus, and a backyard he was about to turn into a garden. He had gotten into the passenger seat. She had looked at him. He had said, "It's done." She had said, "It's done." He had said, "Let's go home." She had driven. He was 53 years old. Dorothy was 52. They had lived in 7 different places across those 28 years. Forts Benning Bragg, Campbell Lewis Hood, and 2 overseas assignments. They had bought a house in Columbus, Georgia, 36 miles from Fort Benning, where they had started, and to which they had, in the way of many military families, returned at the end. The house was a 3-bedroom with a yard that had been primarily lawn when they bought it, and a kitchen that needed a new floor, and a garage that Calvin had thoroughly organized in his first month of retirement with a precision that Dorothy had recognized as his version of what the adjustment required. He needed to take something that was uncertain and make it ordered, and the garage was what was available. He retired and he grew a garden. The retirement itself had a transition period that Dorothy had been prepared for. She had spoken with other military spouses who had navigated it, women who had watched their husbands come home from 20 or 25 or 30 years of service and find themselves suddenly without the structure that had organized every day of their adult lives, and who had described the first months of retirement in terms that ranged from difficult to destabilizing. Dorothy had read everything she could find about military retirement transitions, and she had prepared herself for the particular kind of disorientation that comes when a person who has been doing one thing with total commitment for a long time is no longer doing that thing. Calvin surprised her. He was good at being retired. He had thought about it. She learned this in the first months from conversations that emerged slowly as he settled into the new rhythm with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. He had spent his last 2 years of service thinking about what retirement was for and what he wanted it to contain, and he had arrived at retirement with a list, not a formal document, but a mental inventory of the things he had been deferring for 28 years: the garden, reading, the grandchildren when Jerome and his wife had them, the community at Mount Zion where he wanted to serve on the deacon board, which he had declined twice during active service because he could not commit to the attendance the role required. The mentorship of young men, specifically through a program at the high school near their Columbus house that paired veterans with at-risk male students, which he had read about 3 years before retiring and had thought about steadily since. He had done all of them. He had joined the deacon board 6 months after retiring. He had begun the mentorship program 8 months after retiring, which had paired him with 3 students in the first year and 7 in the second. He had read with the same focused appetite for reading that Dorothy had identified in their first conversation as one of his defining qualities. He read history, mostly military history, but also broader, the history of the Civil Rights era, the history of African Americans in the military from the Revolutionary War, forward, the history of the specific regions where he had served. He had read 12 books about Panama and the Gulf War and Iraq in his first year of retirement. Dorothy had said, "Haven't you already read that from the inside?" He had said reading from the inside and reading from the outside are different activities. The inside tells you what happened to you. The outside tells you what you were part of. He had always wanted a garden, which was something Dorothy had not known about him until his last year of active service, when he had said in the way he said things he had thought about carefully, "When I retire, I want to plant things and watch them grow." She had said then, "We will plant a garden." He had said, "You know, that means the grass section in the backyard." She had said, "I know." He had said, "That's the part you like." She had said, "I know." He planted the garden. He grew tomatoes and green beans and 2 varieties of pepper and a fig tree that had taken 3 years to produce figs, and that had in its 3rd year produced more figs than either of them had known what to do with. He had stood in the backyard in August of the fig tree's 3rd year with a basket full of figs, and he had looked at Dorothy in the kitchen window, and he had held up the basket with an expression on his face that she had not seen in 28 years of watching him manage everything with the controlled competence of a master sergeant, which was the expression of a man who is genuinely surprised and genuinely delighted and is not managing either feeling. She had taken a photograph through the kitchen window. It was still on the refrigerator. He died 11 months ago. He died in November at 69 years old of a cardiac event that was rapid and that the cardiologist had said was in some respects the kind of cardiac event that is not preceded by extensive suffering, which was the gentlest way she had heard a cardiologist say what that particular sentence means. She had been sitting beside him when it happened. They had been watching the evening news. He had said Dorothy. And then he had not said anything else. She had called 911. The paramedics had arrived in 7 minutes. They had worked for 14 minutes. They had said what they had to say. She had called Jerome from the hospital waiting room. She had said, "Jerome, your father died tonight." And then she had listened to her son on the other end of the phone, and she had said, "I know. I know." Jerome Whitfield was 43 years old. He was a major in the United States Army Reserve assigned to a unit at Fort Gillem, and he was his father's son in the specific way that people mean when they say that with full weight. Not just in the physical resemblance, which was considerable, but in the quality of presence, the stillness, the directness, the capacity to be, the steadying force in a room when the room needed steadying. He had flown to Columbus from Atlanta in 3 hours. He had sat with Dorothy in the kitchen from 10 p.m. until 3 in the morning, the two of them at the table where they had eaten every meal in this house for 15 years, the garden visible through the back window in the November dark. They had not talked about Calvin continuously. They had sat in the particular quality of grief that does not require continuous speech, the kind where the presence of another person is the thing, and the words are secondary. They had talked about Calvin in intervals. Between the intervals, they had been quiet. At 3 in the morning, Jerome had said, "Mom, go to bed. I'll be here in the morning." She had said, "I know you will." She had gone to bed. She had not slept until 5:30. She had thought about Calvin's hands. She had thought about 28 years of watching those hands on a rifle and on a garden fork and on the steering wheel and on the basketball in the driveway and on her face when she was crying at Fort Hood in 2003 when he was about to deploy, and she had not wanted to cry and had cried anyway. She had thought about the hands holding the basket of figs up to the kitchen window. She had thought 41 years. She had thought that is not enough. The burial had been at Arlington National Cemetery. Calvin Whitfield had earned the right to be buried at Arlington through 28 years of honorable service and through the specific decorations that documented what that service had contained, the Bronze Star with Valor Device awarded for actions under fire in Iraq in 2003, the Meritorious Service Medal awarded 3 times across his career, 2 Army Commendation Medals, the Combat Infantryman Badge awarded to infantry soldiers who have engaged in active ground combat. The record of his service was the record of a man who had spent 28 years doing what the Army asked of him and who had done it well enough that the record was at its close, the record of someone who had reached the near summit of what a soldier could become without a commission. The burial ceremony was conducted by the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment, also known as the Old Guard, which is the Army unit responsible for all burial ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery. The Old Guard has been conducting this work since 1948. The precision of the ceremony, the folding of the flag, the rendering of honors. The presentation is something the regiment practices every day, which is how something achieved through repetition reaches the quality that makes people, when they witness it, go very quiet. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had been the sergeant of the guard at Calvin Whitfield's burial ceremony. He was 34 years old. He had served in the Army for 12 years, the first 6 as an infantryman in 2 different units before transferring to the Old Guard, the 3rd United States Infantry Regiment for the second 6. He had made his decision to request the Old Guard assignment during a ceremony he had attended not as a participant but as a visitor at the burial of a soldier from his former unit who had been killed in action in Afghanistan. He had watched the Old Guard conduct the ceremony from the family section, and he had thought watching the flag fold, watching the specific, measured, unhurried precision of 6 soldiers turning cloth into a triangle, containing all the meaning the cloth could hold, that this was work worth doing for its own sake. Not combat, not deployment, not the physical challenge of infantry operations, but this, the ceremonial acknowledgement of what a person had given, offered to the people the person had left, done correctly every time. As a matter of institutional commitment, he had requested the transfer that year. He had been assigned to the Old Guard the following year. He had been there since. He was 34 years old. He had conducted hundreds of ceremonies. He had presented hundreds of flags to hundreds of families. He had looked into hundreds of faces at the moment of the presentation and had read in each face the specific grief that belongs to the specific person. No 2 faces the same. No 2 presentations the same in what they contained even when the ceremony was always identical. He had learned in 6 years of this work that the ceremony's value was not the ceremony itself. The ceremony was precise and correct and important, But its value was not in what the soldiers did. Its value was in what the ceremony communicated to the person receiving the flag, that the institution knew what it had asked of the person who had served, and that it was accounting for it publicly with full honor without diminishment. He had looked at Dorothy Whitfield's face at the moment of the flag presentation. He had folded the flag with the precision the ceremony required, and he had knelt, and he had said, on behalf of the President of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your loved one's honorable and faithful service. And he had given her the flag. She had taken it with both hands. She had looked at him. He had held the look for a moment, the ceremony-specific moment of contact that is not personal, but is something more than impersonal, the moment when the sergeant of the guard is present to the person in front of them, and not only to the ceremony. He had returned to his position. Dorothy Whitfield had carried the flag to her car with Jerome beside her, and she had placed it in the trunk in the triangular case, the same way a triangular case had traveled in cars through her childhood, the same way her grandmother had moved it from house to house, and she had sat in the passenger seat, and she had said nothing all the way to the hotel. She had placed the case on the dresser in the hotel room. The room was on the 4th floor, facing north, with a window that showed the tree line of the cemetery at a distance. She had not looked at the window. She had looked at the case on the dresser, the specific triangle of it, the blue field of the flag visible through the glass, the stars at the corners. She had looked at it the way she had looked at the flag case on her grandmother's mantel as a child, with the full understanding of what it contained and what it represented, and with the awareness that the understanding had been lifelong and was now complete in a way it had not been before. She had looked at it for a long time. Jerome had knocked on the connecting door and said, "Mom, come have dinner." She had said, "Not yet." He had said, "You need to eat." She had said, "I know. I will." She had not moved from the chair facing the dresser. The burial had been everything it was supposed to be. She had known it would be. She had been to Arlington before, to the funerals of 2 men from Calvin's unit, and she had watched the old guard conduct those ceremonies with the precision that comes from doing something 1,000 times in service of the thing that matters most. But knowing something would be precise and experiencing the precision directed at you at the flag that was your husband's flag are different things. The ceremony had moved through its stages. The rifle volleys, the taps, the flag folding with the specific quality of something that has been done with full attention by people who understand what it means, and at each stage she had held herself in the steadiness she had decided to bring to it, because she had decided before she got there that this was how she would receive it with the steadiness it deserved. She had held it all the way through until Webb had given her the flag. The flag was lighter than she had expected, which was a strange thing to notice in that moment, and she had noticed it anyway, the way you notice precise things in moments that are too large for general impressions. The case was warm from being in the sun. She had held it against her body and looked at Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb's face, and she had seen there the specific quality of presence that she had described years later to Jerome, as he was with me in that moment, not just doing a ceremony. She had said, "I know the difference." Jerome had said yes. She had said he was with me. Jerome had been beside her in his uniform as the son of a master sergeant and as a major himself, and she had felt his arm against hers, and she had thought, "Calvin's son is here." And that thought had been the one that had come closest to breaking the steadiness, not because it was sad, but because it was true in a way that went further than sadness. She had thought, "This is the beginning of the rest of my life." She had begun coming to the grave the following Saturday, not to perform grief, not because anyone had told her to come. She came because the grave was the specific place where Calvin was, and sitting near the specific place where Calvin was had a quality that sitting elsewhere did not have. She understood this was not rational in the way that most things were rational. She did not require it to be rational. She was 66 years old, and she had spent 41 years making rational decisions about her life, and the decision to sit at her husband's grave on Saturday afternoons was not one she intended to submit to the standard she had applied to everything else. She came every Saturday. She drove from Columbus 3.5 hours on Interstate 85 and then I-66 into Arlington, left at 8 in the morning, arrived before noon, spent 3 to 4 hours at the grave, drove home in the evening. She had made this drive 11 times in 11 months. She packed a small bag, a thermos of coffee, a sandwich, a folding camp chair, the green canvas kind from a sporting goods store lightweight that fit in the trunk beside the flag case, and a small pocket-sized journal black in which she wrote. The drive was not long in the scale of drives she had made in 41 years of military life. She had driven longer routes to reach bases in less accessible locations. She had driven through the night twice in the early years of their marriage when Calvin's unit had been on extended exercises and she had needed to be at a different location when the exercise ended. She knew the rhythm of long driving the way the first hour is a settling in the way the second hour opens into something closer to genuine thought, the way the third hour has a quality of sustained presence that cannot be achieved in shorter drives, the way the specific geography of a repeated route becomes familiar, in the way that familiar things are familiar, not because you are attending to them, but because you have attended to them enough times that they have entered you and are no longer requiring attention. She used the drive to think about Calvin, not deliberately, not as a formal practice. The way you think about a person you have been thinking about continuously since they died, which is without quite deciding to, without quite stopping. The thoughts moved. The way thoughts move on long drives, associatively following their own logic rather than the logic of chronology or significance. She would think about the kitchen in the house at Fort Campbell, which had been the smallest kitchen of any house they had lived in, and in which she had cooked every day for 3 years, and which she had, for reasons she could not entirely explain, been sad to leave. She would think about the night Calvin had driven 3 hours to bring her medication when she had been sick during an early deployment rotation, and he had had a 48-hour pass and had used it to drive to her rather than to sleep, which was not the practical decision, and was exactly the decision he had made. She would think about his hands on the steering wheel of the car they had bought with his re-enlistment bonus. The first car they had bought knew a specific thrill that she had not anticipated, and that Calvin had approached with characteristic practicality and beneath the practicality pleasure. The thoughts came on the drive, and she let them come. She had been a school librarian for 32 years. She had spent her career in the specific relationship with writing that librarians develop. Not writing that performs itself, not writing intended for an audience, but writing as a practice of knowing the kind you do to understand what you think, to take hold of something that is moving too fast or sitting too still inside you and slow it down or make it visible. She wrote at Calvin's grave. She wrote about things she remembered. She wrote about things he had said. She wrote about the garden which she was tending alone now, and which had produced figs again this year, and which she had picked and made into preserves and distributed to Jerome and to the neighbors and to the woman at the church who had brought meals in the first month after Calvin died, and whom Dorothy had been feeding in return ever since, in the indirect way that grief communities develop their economies of care. She wrote about the mentorship program at the high school, which she had contacted to let them know that Calvin had passed, and which had, in the spring, named a room in the program's building after him. Not a large gesture, a framed photograph and a small plaque beside the door, but one she had sat with for a long time when Jerome had sent her the photograph of it. She wrote about the fig tree, which she had decided to keep producing because Calvin had wanted it to produce and because refusing to tend it would be the wrong kind of tribute. She wrote to him, not letters exactly, not in the format of letters, more like speech, the things she would have said at dinner or in the car or in the kitchen in the evening. The running current of a 41-year conversation that had stopped abruptly and that she was sustaining on her end into the journal in the knowledge that the current no longer had a counterpart on the other side, and in the stubbornness that refused to let that stop her from speaking. She had thought in the first weeks that the writing would diminish over time, that it was the acute phase of grief expressing itself and would slow as the acute phase did. It had not diminished. If anything, it had deepened the way a practice deepens when you continue it past the point of expectation, past the place where you thought it would end into the place where it becomes something it was not in the beginning. The journal had been a practical choice initially. She had begun it not at the grave, but at home in the first days after the burial, when sleep was unreliable and the nights were long and the house made sounds at 2 in the morning that it had always made, but that were different now that she was the only one in it to hear them. She had found a pocket journal in the top drawer of the desk in the small room Calvin had used as an office, which was where he had kept the files and done the paperwork of a retired man's organized life. The pension documents, the healthcare records, the correspondence with the VA. The journal had been unused. She did not know where it had come from, whether he had bought it for a purpose and not used it, or whether it had been a gift, or whether it had simply accumulated in the drawer the way things accumulate in a desk drawer across years. It was small, black covered with a red ribbon marker. She had taken it to the kitchen table at 2 in the morning on the third night after the burial, and she had opened it to the first page and she had written, "Calvin died November 14th. I am sitting in the kitchen. The lights are on. The garden is dark." She had not said anything else that night. She had returned to it the following day and the day after that, and it had become the practice she brought to the grave when she began coming. Not a formal record, not a therapeutic exercise in the therapeutic sense, but the natural continuation of a writing practice that had developed from the specific need to say something to someone who was no longer there to say it to. The grave gave the writing a location. The location gave the writing a quality it had not had at the kitchen table, the sense of proximity of sitting near, of the written word being offered in the direction of the person it was addressed to. It was not rational. She did not require it to be rational. She was 67 years old, and she understood the difference between what was rationally justified and what was necessary, and this was necessary in a way that did not require justification. The other widows in Section 60 on Saturday afternoons were women she had come to know by sight and gradually by name. Section 60 at Arlington is the section where many of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans are buried. It was at the time of Calvin's burial one of the sections with the highest concentration of fresh graves veterans who had died in service in the late stages of service, or in the years immediately following from the wounds and costs of 2 decades of war. The families who came to Section 60 were often younger than Dorothy, younger than the average Arlington visitor, carrying a specific kind of grief that comes from loss too early. Dorothy was older. Her grief was 41 years long in its accumulation, which made it different in character, if not in weight. She had met Margaret Osei, not related to anyone, just a Margaret Osei from Prince George's County who came every other Saturday to the grave of her son, Specialist Kwame Osei, 24, killed in action in 2018. Margaret was 52. She brought flowers, every visit always yellow, because Kwame had said yellow was too loud for flowers, and Margaret had disagreed, and was continuing to disagree by proxy. Dorothy and Margaret had found themselves sitting within sight of each other for 3 consecutive Saturdays before either of them spoke, which was the specific rhythm of Section 60, where the proximity of grief made people cautious about intruding on each other's version of it. Margaret had spoken first. She had said, "Are those Mums?" And Dorothy had said, "They are." And from Mums, they had moved to Calvin and then to Kwame, and then to the long, unstructured conversation that grief communities fall into. Not linear, not organized, moving from grief to ordinary life, to memory, to humor and back without needing to explain the transitions, because the transitions do not need to be explained to someone who is sitting in the same section on the same Saturday afternoon. They had coffee from Dorothy's thermos. Dorothy had brought a second thermos the following Saturday. There were others. Colonel Bernard Tatum, retired 78, who came every other week to his wife's grave. Eleanor Tatum, who had died 3 years before Calvin, and whose grave was in the row 2 behind Calvin's, and who sometimes sat with Dorothy for a while and talked about Fort Benning in the 1970s. Colonel Tatum had been a signals officer, which was a different world from Calvin's infantry world, and the conversations they had had across their respective Fort Benning years had almost no overlap in terms of the specific work they had each been doing, but they shared the geography and the specific community of a post in that era. The officers' club, the commissary, the particular social world of a military installation in the South in the 1970s when the Army was still navigating what it had come out of and who it was becoming. She found Colonel Tatum easier to talk to than most people, which she had attributed, when she thought about it, to the fact that he understood without being told what the Saturday visits were about, because he was doing the same thing for the same reasons. And that shared understanding made the space between them comfortable in a way that the space between her and most of the people in her civilian life was not, because those people were kind and they wanted to help, and they did not know what they were in the presence of, and that unknowing required management that the Saturday people did not require. There was a young woman named Priya South Asian who came to her husband's grave every Sunday, but sometimes on Saturdays, who was 31 years old and who had 2 small children she sometimes brought and sometimes did not. Her husband had been 28 when he was killed. She had been 27. She had 2 children and was working part-time from home and completing a graduate degree in public health, which Dorothy had learned about over several Saturdays of conversation, and which she had found in the learning to be a thing worth noting. This woman at 31 with 2 children and a husband dead in this ground was building something. Dorothy had said the Saturday she had learned about the degree you are doing exactly the right thing. Priya had looked at her with the expression of someone who needed to hear that and had not expected it from this direction. She had said, "Do you think so?" Dorothy had said, "I know so. I know what it means to build something while carrying something heavy. You do both, or you do neither." Priya had been quiet for a moment. She had said, "That's what my mother keeps telling me." Dorothy had said, "Your mother is correct." These were the people of Dorothy Whitfield's Saturday afternoons. She thought of them when she thought of them generally as the Section 60 community, which was not a name they used for themselves, but was what they were: a loose, self-organized group of people who came to the same place for the same reason, and who had over time developed the specific intimacy of people who share proximity to grief without necessarily sharing the details of their lives. They knew the important things about each other. They had come to those things naturally in the slow way that Section 60 produced them. A name mentioned, a date, noted a story offered when the moment was right and declined when it was not. Colonel Tatum had been the one to tell her about the full scope of Section 60, about the history of the section, the decisions about interment policy that had produced it, the particular concentration of young graves. He had walked her through it one Saturday in the spring, pointing out names she had come to know from passing them, but had not connected to their histories. He was a man who had spent decades in the Army, and who had a retired officer's ease with institutional history. The sense of having been inside the institution long enough to understand its architecture, including the parts that were not explained on any sign. He had said these men and women served in 2 wars simultaneously. Most of them were 22, 25, 28 when they deployed. They are all here now. She had said Calvin served in 2 wars too, different wars. He had said yes, different generation, same weight. She had thought about that for a long time. Margaret Osei had become across 11 months the person Dorothy most regularly shared the Saturday drive home with in her mind, not on the phone during the drive because driving and talking was not something she did, but in the internal processing that happened on the way back when she would think about the conversation from that afternoon. Margaret had a directness that Dorothy recognized as kindred. She did not soften things for the sake of comfort, and she did not ask for them to be softened. She had once said about the year after Kwame died, "The worst thing anyone said to me was that he's in a better place." And Dorothy had said, "I understand that." And Margaret had said, "I know you do." And from that exchange had grown the specific quality of their Saturday relationship, which was honesty without rehearsal, without the need for comfort that required the truth to be managed. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had seen all of them. He had seen them not because he was watching them specifically, but because the work of the old guard at Arlington is constant and visible, and conducted in proximity to every section of the cemetery. The Saturday honor guard walked the full perimeter and conducted ceremonies in the sections where services were scheduled, and the walk brought them through Section 60 at approximately 4:15 every Saturday afternoon, which was the hour at which the last service of the day was typically concluding, and the guard was beginning the walk back to quarters. He had seen Dorothy Whitfield every Saturday for 11 months. He had seen the green camp chair. He had seen the thermos. He had seen the journal. He had seen the yellow flowers on Kwame Osei's grave, his mother's running argument which he had come to understand without ever being told its history, simply by observing that the flowers were always yellow and always fresh. He had seen Colonel Tatum, who was always in the same spot, and who always nodded to Webb when the guard passed with the nod of one military professional to another, containing in its economy the full acknowledgement of what they were both doing here. He had not introduced himself to Dorothy. The protocols of the cemetery are specific about this. The honor guard is present in the cemetery in a ceremonial and professional capacity. They are not there to socialize with visitors. They are present to perform the ceremony and to maintain the dignity of the space. He had remained in his professional role, but he had seen her. He had recognized her from the ceremony 11 months ago, and he had seen her again the following Saturday and the Saturday after that. And he had recognized in the continuity of her presence and the specific quality of attention she brought to the grave what she was doing here and what it meant. And he had carried that understanding the way you carry things you have witnessed that deserve to be carried carefully. Webb had been conducting burial ceremonies at Arlington for 6 years. In that time, he had come to understand something about the families of the buried, specifically about the ones who came back. Most families came to the burial and then returned for anniversaries and specific occasions, which was the pattern most consistent with the geography of loss. You came when you could, and you made the distance meaningful by making it occasional. The ones who came regularly were the ones who needed the regularity for reasons that were not always easily described, but were always clearly felt. They had organized their lives around it. They came with their chairs and their coffee and their journals and their flowers, and they sat and they were present to their person in the only way available to them, which was the presence of proximity of sitting near of the grave as the closest thing to the person that the world still contained. He had seen it enough times to understand it without needing it explained to him. He had not spoken to Dorothy Whitfield in 11 months. But when he walked through Section 60 every Saturday afternoon at 4:15, and saw the green camp chair at Calvin Whitfield's grave, he had each time carried that moment in the way that people carry things they have taken responsibility for, not as a burden, but as a trust. That was the Saturday that Officer Derek Pruitt approached Dorothy Whitfield at 4:43 in the afternoon. Derek Pruitt was 29 years old. He had been with the Arlington National Cemetery Security Detail for 14 months. He was not a soldier and had not served in the military. He had studied criminal justice at Northern Virginia Community College and had applied for the security position as an entry-level position in federal security work, which was one of several paths into federal law enforcement. He was not a bad officer in the general sense of his function. He had not yet developed the specific quality of attention that 14 months in a place like Arlington can develop in a person who pays attention, which is the capacity to read the specific weight of what you are in the presence of, and to adjust your conduct accordingly. Arlington National Cemetery operates with a visitor policy that is specific and that reflects the nature of the place. It is a national cemetery, a working cemetery, a cemetery that conducts burial ceremonies every operating day and that receives hundreds of thousands of visitors per year. And the visitor policy is designed to balance the rights of grieving families and regular visitors against the operational requirements of a space that is also a federal installation with specific security and maintenance requirements. The closing time of 5 p.m. was not arbitrary. It was the time at which the grounds needed to be clear to allow the end-of-day maintenance operations and security checks that the cemetery's management required. The closing time reminder walk was a reasonable policy. The directive was clearly communicated. The officers who received it had the tools and the training to implement it in a way that was consistent with the dignity that Arlington required. Pruitt had been given a directive that week past from the cemetery administrator to the supervisors to the detail officers regarding visitors remaining at graves after the announced closing time. The closing time at Arlington is 5 p.m. The administrator had noted that recent weeks had produced an above-average number of visitors remaining beyond the announced time, and that officers should begin the reminder walk at 4:30 to allow enough time for visitors to be clear of the grounds by 5. Pruitt had begun his reminder walk at 4:30. He had made 3 stops in the sections east of Section 60, and each stop had gone the way the protocol intended. He had said the closing time, the visitor had acknowledged it, and begun gathering their things, and he had moved on. None of those 3 visitors had presented any complexity. None of them had been sitting in a camp chair beside a grave for 5 hours. None of them had been at Arlington every Saturday for 11 months. He had worked the east sections first. He had spoken to 2 visitors who had thanked him and begun gathering their things. He had reached Section 60 at 4:43. He had been wearing his uniform for 14 months. And doing this work for 14 months, and in those 14 months, he had not yet developed the quality of attention that the work required in its deepest form. Not the procedural attention, he knew the procedures and he followed them, but the specific, cultivated awareness of context that places like Arlington develop in the people who work there, when those people are paying the right kind of attention. The awareness that the woman in the chair, and the man in the grave, and the flag on the mantel somewhere, and the 41 years between them are not separate elements but a single thing, and that approaching any part of that thing requires approaching all of it. He had seen the woman in the green camp chair. She was the only visitor still seated in Section 60. She was writing in a journal. Her thermos was on the ground beside the chair. She had a small arrangement of flowers, white asters this particular Saturday, set against the headstone in front of her. He had approached. He had said, "Ma'am, I need to let you know that the cemetery closes in about 15 minutes. You'll need to start heading toward the exit." She had looked up from the journal. She had looked at him with the composed, unhurried attention of someone who has been interrupted at something they were not finished with and who is deciding how to respond. She had said, "I understand. I'll be a few more minutes." He had said, "Ma'am, I really need you to begin making your way out now." She had said, "Officer, I am sitting with my husband. I will be a few more minutes." Dorothy had been interrupted at graves before by other visitors, by cemetery groundskeepers, at other locations, once by a child who had wandered away from its family and ended up at Calvin's grave, and looked at her in the serious, direct way that children look at unfamiliar adults, and said, "Who lives here?" She had said, "A soldier." The child had said, "What kind?" She had said, "The best kind." The child had looked at the headstone for a moment and then wandered back toward its family. Dorothy had thought about that exchange for several Saturdays afterward. She had not been interrupted by a security officer before today. She had been at Calvin's grave since 11:47 in the morning. She had drunk her coffee. She had eaten the sandwich turkey, the bread from the good bakery on River Road in Columbus that Calvin had liked, and that she now bought every week specifically because she did not want the category of things she bought specifically because Calvin had liked them to diminish. She had been writing in the journal since 2:15. It was now 4:43. She was in the middle of an entry about the deacon board. Deacon Richardson had called her the previous week to say that Calvin's chair at the board table had not been reassigned and would remain designated in his name for the year following his death, which was the protocol the board had established for deceased members, and which she had not known, and which had made her sit down at the kitchen table and do the thing she rarely allowed herself cry without restraint briefly and then stop, and do what the information required of her, which was to write back a thank you, and to feel for a sustained moment the weight of what the people in Calvin's life were doing to hold his place. She had been in the middle of that entry when Pruitt arrived. He had looked at the headstone. He had read the name Whitfield Calvin James. He had read the rank Master Sergeant USA, Master Sergeant. He had read the dates. He had read the service branch. He had said, "Ma'am, do you even know whose section you're sitting in?" She heard the question with the complete attention she brought to everything that came at her from the world. She had heard questions like this before, not here, not in this context, but in the general shape of it. The question asked from a position of assumed superiority, with the embedded suggestion that the person being asked is present somewhere they should not be or for a reason they cannot adequately account for. She had heard it in the school district from administrators who had looked at her, a black woman in a library position in the early years of her career, and asked their version of the same question. She had heard it in various shapes across 41 years. She had developed across those 41 years a specific response to it. Not anger, not explanation, not the marshalling of evidence, but a particular quality of stillness that communicated without words, that the question had been heard and assessed, and found to be a question about the person asking it, not about her. The question was condescending in the specific way that condescension operates. When it does not know it is condescending as a genuine inquiry from a position of assumed ignorance on the part of the person being asked about something, the asker believes the person does not know. The embedded assumption was this woman is sitting in this section because she wandered in, not because she belongs here. Dorothy Whitfield looked at him. She did not answer the question. She set the journal in her lap and looked at him with the full, still attention of someone who has heard something and is deciding whether it deserves a response, and has decided that the question itself is the answer. He said, "This section is for decorated combat veterans, ma'am." She thought about the Bronze Star with Valor Device. She thought about the 2 Iraq tours. She thought about Panama and the Gulf, and 28 years of service that had taken Calvin from a private first class at Fort Benning to a master sergeant who had served in 4 combat or combat-adjacent operations, and who had retired with a service record that the Army had acknowledged at Arlington with the full ceremony of the Old Guard, with the rifles and the taps and the flag folded to the specific dimensions required and presented to her by a sergeant of the guard who had looked at her with the full presence of someone who understood what he was handing her. She said, "I know what this section is." She said it without heat, without explanation. She said it the way you say something that is simply true to someone who needs to hear that it is true without providing the full history that makes it true, because the full history was not something she owed him, and because the truth itself was complete without it. He said, "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to come with me. If you're unable to comply with the closing time, I'll need to escort you out." He stepped toward her. He reached for her arm. The honor guard turned. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb was at the north end of Section 60 at that moment, completing the final perimeter walk with the 5-member detail behind him. 3 ceremonial riflemen, a flag bearer, and the duty bugler. They had been moving south through the section following the route that brought them through Section 60 at the end of the afternoon walk, and Webb had seen the interaction developing from 40 feet away, and he had seen the woman in the green camp chair. And he had known in the way you know things that you have been witnessing for 11 months, every Saturday afternoon, exactly who she was. Exactly. He stopped. He turned to face Dorothy Whitfield. He brought himself to full attention. He raised his right hand to the brim of his dress blue cover, the formal Army salute index finger touching the lower right edge of the brim hand-flat elbow at the correct angle, and he held it. He had decided in the 3 seconds between seeing Pruitt's hand reach toward Dorothy Whitfield and bringing himself to attention with the speed and clarity of a decision made not from analysis, but from 12 years of knowing what was right and what was not. He had seen the interaction from 40 feet away. He had seen Pruitt approach, had seen the question being asked. He could not hear the words, but he could read the posture, the tilt, the specific geometry of someone speaking down toward someone seated, and he had read it accurately. He had seen Dorothy's stillness. He had seen the hand reach for her arm. He had stopped walking. The 5 members of his detail stopped behind him in the trained automatic way of a unit that does not require a verbal command to hold. He had thought, "I have been watching her come here every Saturday for 11 months. I have watched her sit in that chair and write in that journal and have coffee and sit with her husband's name on that stone. I gave her that flag. I looked at her face when I gave it to her. I know what this section is, and I know who she is, and I know what she is doing here." He had also thought the man who is buried in that ground served for 28 years. He received the Bronze Star with Valor for actions under fire. He completed 2 combat tours in Iraq and 2 additional combat operations across a 28-year career. He retired as a master sergeant and was buried at Arlington with the full ceremony of the Old Guard, which I was part of, which I conducted, because that is what this section is for, and that is what this institution exists to do. He had thought, and the person who has been coming to sit beside that grave every Saturday for 11 months is being asked if she knows where she is. He had brought himself to attention. He had raised the salute. He held it for 7 seconds. The 5 members of the honor detail behind him executed the same movement simultaneously and without a verbal command, in the way that units move when they have been together long enough that the commanding motion is understood before it is completed, not because they had been ordered, not because the protocol required it, because they saw what he saw, and because the 5 of them had been walking Section 60 on Saturday afternoons for long enough to know what they were in the presence of, and the response that the moment required was the response their sergeant of the guard was already executing, and they executed it with him. 6 soldiers in full ceremonial dress in Section 60 of Arlington National Cemetery on a Saturday afternoon in October, rendering a hand salute to Dorothy Mae Whitfield, widow of Master Sergeant Calvin James Whitfield, USA, retired in the presence of one security officer who had just asked her if she knew what section she was sitting in. The afternoon light was at its October angle low and specific, the kind of light that falls sideways through the trees along the paths and makes the white headstones look illuminated from within, rather than lit from without. The cemetery was very quiet. The last ceremony of the day had ended 30 minutes ago. The grounds were nearly empty, a handful of visitors in other sections, none of them looking this way, none of them aware of what was happening in Section 60. The sound was what you could hear birds in the trees along the path, the distant sound of traffic from the road beyond the cemetery boundary, the ambient quiet of a large outdoor space in late afternoon. 6 soldiers standing at attention holding the salute. The salute was not for the grave. The Army salutes graves differently, with a rifle volley with taps with the flag ceremony. The hand salute is rendered to a person, to a superior officer, or to a specific individual as an expression of formal respect from a subordinate. Staff Sergeant Webb was not obligated to salute Dorothy Whitfield. She held no rank. She held no position of authority over him. He saluted her because he chose to, because he had watched her sit at her husband's grave every Saturday for 11 months in a green camp chair with a thermos and a journal and white flowers this week, and yellow flowers before, and because he had been present at the ceremony when Calvin Whitfield was buried. And he had given her the flag, and he had looked at her face in that moment, and he had understood what that flag was receiving and what it was being given to, because he knew what this section was and who she was and what she was doing here. And he had known it for 11 months, and he was not going to stand in a section that contained Calvin James Whitfield's grave and watch the person who had been married to that man for 41 years be asked if she knew where she was. Because the salute was the correct response. It was the only correct response. And because he had spent 12 years learning to identify the correct response and give it, and because that was what the Army had trained him to do, and because what the Army had trained him to do, and what this moment required, happened in this case to be exactly the same thing. Dorothy Whitfield looked at Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb. She received the salute. She did not cry. She was not the crying type in public, which was a thing she had decided somewhere in the middle years of military life, not as a repression, but as a choice that certain things deserved to be received with a steadiness that matched their gravity, and that the steadiness was its own form of honoring what was being offered. She gave a single precise nod, the nod of someone who has been in military culture for 41 years, and understands exactly what a salute is and who it is for and what it means when the sergeant of the guard who buried your husband 6 months later renders you a full honor salute in front of an officer who just asked you if you knew what section you were sitting in. The salute held, then Webb brought his hand down. The detail behind him brought their hands down. Webb said nothing. He did not address Pruitt. He did not address Dorothy. He looked at the section for a moment, the graves, the afternoon light, the headstones with their names, and then he turned and resumed the walk, the five-member detail falling in behind him. They walked south out of Section 60. The afternoon was very quiet. Officer Pruitt was standing at the edge of the scene with his hand still half extended from the moment he had reached toward Dorothy Whitfield's arm, which he had not completed reaching toward, because the motion of the honor guard had stopped him. He stood in the specific stillness of someone who has been made in public to understand something about where they are and what they are in the presence of, and who is processing the gap between what they thought they were doing and what they have just been shown they were doing. He said nothing. Dorothy Whitfield looked at him. He was standing in the specific stillness of someone who has just understood something about where they are and what they have done, and who does not yet know what to do with the understanding. His radio was on his hip. His hand was at his side. He was 29 years old, and he had been in this cemetery for 14 months, and he had walked past Calvin Whitfield's headstone dozens of times, and he had never looked at it the way he should have looked at it, which was to say, as a record complete and specific, containing within its lines everything necessary to understand who was in this ground and who might be sitting beside it. The salute had told him what he had been looking at. Dorothy looked at him the way she looked at anything that needed to be seen clearly. Directly, without flinching, without heat, with the full attention of a woman who had been in the presence of difficult things many times across 67 years, and who had learned that the correct response to a difficult thing was not to look away from it, but to look at it with complete clarity and then to say what was true. She said his name was Calvin James Whitfield, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired. 28 years of service, Bronze Star with Valor, 2 tours in Iraq. We were married for 41 years. She said it quietly. She said it without anger. She said it the way you state a record with the precision of someone who knows the record is correct and is presenting it as evidence, not as argument. She said it because the question he had asked, "Do you even know whose section you're sitting in?" deserved an answer. And she was going to give it the answer it deserved in full, specifically, without abridgment, because the record was not an abstraction, and it was not a source of pride in the performance sense. It was simply what was true. He had looked at the headstone when she named Calvin. She had watched him look. She had watched him read the rank. She had watched him process the distance between what he had assumed he was looking at and what he was actually looking at, which was not a distance that could be crossed in real time, but that had been crossed in the 53 seconds of the salute, and in the 7 seconds of the held hand, and in the single nod she had given to Staff Sergeant Webb. He had said nothing during her statement. She had not required him to say anything. She stood up from this green camp chair. She folded it with the efficient motion of someone who has folded it 11 times before. She picked up her thermos and her journal. She set the asters more securely against the headstone, pressed the stems a fraction more firmly into the soil at the base of the stone, the way you secure something you want to stay in place after you have gone. She looked at Calvin's name one more time. She said, "I'll leave now." She walked toward the exit. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Gibson had been at his colleague's grave 40 feet east watching. He had not announced himself, and he did not announce himself now because the moment was not one that required his presence, and because his presence would have changed the quality of what was happening, which was not his to change. He had watched the full sequence from the beginning, the approach, the question, the stillness, the honor guard. He had raised his phone when the salute began, not because he planned to post the footage, but because he recognized with the certainty that 30 years of military service produces the certainty that comes from having attended enough ceremonies and witnessed enough honors and been in the presence of enough moments that carry the full weight of what the institution is supposed to be, that what was happening needed to be witnessed and preserved. He had kept the camera on Dorothy as she walked toward the exit. He had caught at the edge of the frame the headstone with Calvin's name. He had caught Pruitt standing at the margin of the scene, not moving, not speaking in the stillness of someone who is beginning to understand what they have done. He had held the camera until she was out of frame. He had sat for a very long time. There was a visitor in Section 60 who had been at a grave 40 feet to the east, a man named Raymond Gibson. 64, retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel, who had been there to visit a colleague's grave and who had watched the full sequence of events from that distance: Pruitt's approach, the question, Dorothy's stillness, the honor guard turning the salute. He had filmed it on his phone, not planning to. He had raised it because he saw something happening and understood, with 30 years of military experience behind him, that what was happening was something that should be witnessed. He had filmed from the salute through Dorothy's departure. He had sat for a long time after she was gone. He thought about what he had witnessed. He had spent 30 years in uniform. He had been in rooms and on flight lines and at ceremonies where the full weight of military culture was present and legible. He had seen full-dress ceremonies at the Pentagon. He had attended the funerals of general officers. He had stood at attention at memorials where the accumulated service of the nation's military dead pressed against the walls of the room like something physical. He had not seen what he saw in Section 60 on a Saturday afternoon in October. He had seen a woman who had been at her husband's grave for 3 hours, writing in a journal, being asked if she knew what section she was sitting in. He had seen the stillness she had produced in response, which was not the stillness of someone who did not know the answer, but the stillness of someone who understood that the answer was not owed. He had seen 6 soldiers decide simultaneously, and without being ordered, that this moment required a specific response, and that the response was a salute held for 7 seconds in the October light. He had seen the single nod she gave, which contained in its economy 41 years of military life and the specific knowledge of what a salute was and who it was for. He thought, I need people to see this. He had posted the footage that evening. By midnight, the footage had been viewed 60,000 times. By the following morning, it had been viewed 400,000 times. By the end of the second day, the number was 2.7 million. The footage showed the salute. It showed the 6 soldiers in ceremonial dress, the hand salute held for 7 seconds, the identical motion of the 5-member detail, the precision of the execution, the kind of precision that is visible even to people who do not know the military, who can recognize in the uniformity and the held stillness that what they are watching is something that has been done with full intention. It showed Dorothy Whitfield's back. She was facing the grave during the salute, so the camera showed her in 3/4 profile, her posture, the single nod. It showed Pruitt standing to the side, visible but not centered, the half-extended hand, the specific stillness of someone who has just understood something and does not know what to do with the understanding. The footage was 53 seconds long from the moment the salute began to the moment Dorothy walked out of frame. The footage also captured at the edge of the frame the headstone, Whitfield Calvin James, MSGUSA. People read the name. They looked up the record, the Bronze Star with Valor, the 2 Iraq deployments, the Meritorious Service Medals, the Army Commendation Medals, the Combat Infantryman Badge. They found the dates. They calculated the years. They found Calvin James Whitfield's service documented in the specific way that military service is documented: partially visible in public databases, partially visible in unit records, fully visible to anyone who read the headstone and understood what Master Sergeant meant and what Valor Device meant on a Bronze Star. They read it, and they understood what the question, "Do you even know whose section you're sitting in?" had been directed at, and what the answer was, and what the 7-second salute said in response. In the 48 hours after the footage was posted, Lieutenant Colonel Gibson received 243 replies, direct messages, and emails about the post. He responded to none of them individually. He posted one additional sentence the following morning: her name is Dorothy Whitfield. She comes every Saturday. The investigation into the incident was opened by the Arlington National Cemetery Administrative Office the Monday following the Saturday of the events. In response to the footage, the formal incident report filed by Staff Sergeant Webb's commanding officer at the Old Guard on the same evening, and a written statement from Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Gibson, USAF, retired, submitted to the cemetery office directly. The Old Guard incident report was written by Captain Theodore Barnes, the commanding officer of Webb's company, who had reviewed the footage and spoken with Webb on Saturday evening, and who had by Sunday morning reviewed Master Sergeant Calvin Whitfield's service record in full. The report ran 6 pages. Its summary section read, Staff Sergeant Webb's conduct was consistent with the highest traditions of the old guard and represented an appropriate and honorable expression of respect for a military family member in the face of officer conduct that was inconsistent with the dignity of Arlington National Cemetery. Webb's decision to render the hand salute was not covered by any standing protocol and was therefore a discretionary act. The report recommended that no adverse action be taken regarding Webb's conduct, and that the incident be used as a training example for the appropriate standard of visitor engagement expected of all personnel operating in the cemetery. Captain Barnes had included in the report's appendix a brief summary of Master Sergeant Calvin Whitfield's service record, which he had pulled from the military personnel database as a matter of documentation. The summary included the decorations, the combat deployments, the retirement date. He had also included separately a brief note about Dorothy Whitfield's regular visits to Section 60, the dates of each Saturday visit documented in the cemetery's visitor log, which recorded all vehicles entering the grounds and the duration of their visits. 11 entries, every Saturday for 11 months. He had included it because he wanted the record to be complete. He had included it also because he wanted the people reviewing this incident to understand what Officer Pruitt had walked up to that Saturday afternoon. Not just a visitor in a green camp chair. The person who came every Saturday for 11 months without fail to sit with a man who had served for 28 years, and who was now in this ground, and who had come back the next Saturday, and would come back the Saturday after that. The cemetery administrative office completed its review in 7 days. The review convened a 3-person panel that included the Deputy Director for Visitor Services, the Chief of Security for the cemetery grounds, and a representative from the Office of the Superintendent. The panel reviewed the footage, the Old Guard report, Gibson's statement, and 2 additional statements from cemetery groundskeeping staff who had been in the area of Section 60 that afternoon, and who had observed portions of the interaction. The panel also reviewed the directive that had been issued the previous week regarding closing time enforcement, examining the language of the directive to determine whether it had created any ambiguity about escalation protocols. It had not. The escalation protocol was clear. Officers were to make verbal contact request that visitors begin departing, and if a visitor was uncooperative, contact a supervisor for guidance before taking any physical action. Pruitt had not contacted a supervisor. He had also not returned to the question of whether his assessment of the situation was correct before acting on it, which was the step the panel found most significant in its review of the event. The review found that Officer Pruitt had acted within his authority in beginning the closing time reminder walk, but had violated the cemetery's visitor conduct policy in 2 specific respects. First, his question, "Do you even know whose section you're sitting in?" had been condescending and inconsistent with the language standards that the policy required for interactions with visitors at grave sites. Second, his attempt to physically escort a seated visitor without first obtaining a supervisor's authorization was a procedural deviation from the escalation protocol that the directive in question explicitly required him to follow. The panel spent a significant amount of its deliberation on the first, finding the language question. The legal standard for what constituted a language violation in visitor interaction policy was specific and required evidence that the language had caused demonstrable harm or constituted harassment. The panel reviewed the applicable policy and reviewed the footage and reviewed the statement Gibson had filed, which described the question as condescending and dismissive, and it found in a 2-to-1 decision that the language violated the dignity standard of the visitor interaction policy. The dissenting member had noted that the violation was ambiguous. The other 2 members of the panel had noted that they had watched a 67-year-old woman who came to her husband's grave every Saturday for 11 months be asked if she knew whose section she was sitting in, and that the dignity standard was not particularly ambiguous in that context. The review did not address the deeper question that the footage raised because the administrative review was a procedural document and addressed procedural matters. The deeper question was addressed in the Old Guard's report and in the statement Gibson had filed and in the 340 emails the cemetery office received in the week following the footage's release, and in the statement issued by the Army on the 9th day after the incident, which said the United States Army honors all military family members and recognizes their sacrifice. What was captured in this footage reflects the Army's commitment to treating military families with the full dignity and respect they have earned through their loved ones' service. The statement was issued by the Army's Public Affairs Office. It was 5 sentences long. The last sentence said, "We are grateful for the service and sacrifice of Master Sergeant Calvin James Whitfield and all who serve and have served." The statement used Calvin's name. The formal investigation found that Pruitt's conduct warranted a formal written reprimand, mandatory retraining in visitor interaction protocols, and a 90-day supervised performance period, during which his interactions with visitors would be documented. The reprimand was entered into his personnel file. He retained his position. He remained assigned to Arlington National Cemetery. The decision to retain him was reviewed and upheld on the grounds that the conduct, while violating policy, was not at the level of severity that warranted termination. This was a procedural determination. The people who reviewed it knew it was a procedural determination. The people who had watched the footage had other words for what they had seen, and the procedural determination and those other words existed in the same record and did not resolve each other. Derek Pruitt walked the cemetery grounds every day in the weeks after the investigation was closed. He had been assigned to a supervised route with a senior officer present for all visitor interactions, which was not the most comfortable assignment he had been given. He did not speak publicly about the incident. He did not request a transfer to a different post, though he had been told he could. He remained. Whether he had learned the thing that the incident was most directly about what it meant to look at a woman in a green camp chair at a grave in Section 60 and ask her if she knew where she was not something that the investigation measured or that the reprimand document addressed. It was a private matter. The external record could record what he had done and the consequences that had followed. It could not record what he understood about why. Jerome Whitfield learned of the incident the day the footage went online. He had seen it on Sunday morning before anyone in his unit had thought to contact him. He had been making coffee when the notification appeared, not from someone who knew him, not from a news alert, but from a veterans group he followed, which had shared the footage with the caption, "This is what the old guard does." He had clicked through and seen his mother's back the green camp chair, the headstone with his father's name, and the 6 soldiers in ceremonial dress with their hands raised. He had sat down. He had watched it once all the way through. He had watched it again. He had watched it a 3rd time this time, pausing at the moment of the nod. The single, contained nod his mother gave to the sergeant of the guard, which was such a precise expression of who she was that he had felt in watching it, the specific mixture of grief and recognition that belongs to the child who knows a parent well enough to identify them in a single gesture from 40 feet away in a 53-second video. He had called Dorothy. She had said, "I'm fine, Jerome." He had said, "Mom." She had said, "I'm fine." He was a young officer who didn't know what he was looking at. And then the honor guard showed him. Jerome had wanted to say more. There were several things he had wanted to say, including things about the officer and about the question the officer had asked, and about what it had meant to watch his 67-year-old mother sit in that chair while someone asked her if she knew what section she was sitting in, as if the 41 years and the 7 houses and the 28 deployments and the flag on the mantel in Columbus were not a sufficient answer to that question. He had wanted to say all of those things. He had said, "Are you going back next Saturday?" She had said, "Of course I'm going back next Saturday." He had said, "Good." Jerome had filed no formal complaint. He was an active-duty reserve officer, and the protocols for how active-duty personnel engage with civilian security matters were specific, and he understood the protocols. He also understood that his mother had handled what had happened with the full competence she brought to everything, and that his filing a complaint would be his response to the situation, not hers, and that she had not asked for it. What he did was write a letter not to the cemetery administrator, not to the investigating office, but directly to Captain Theodore Barnes of the Old Guard. He wrote it at his kitchen table on Sunday afternoon after the call with Dorothy. He wrote it in the same way his father had done everything he set himself to do, directly, without flourish, without performing anything beyond what the letter needed to contain. The letter was 2 paragraphs. The first paragraph said, "My name is Jerome Whitfield, Major U.S. Army Reserve, son of Master Sergeant Calvin James Whitfield and Dorothy May Whitfield. I watched the footage of what happened in Section 60 on Saturday. I want you to know that what Staff Sergeant Webb did, and what his detail did with him, is something my mother will carry for the rest of her life. Not the incident, what he did." The second paragraph said, "My father spent 28 years serving in this army. He is buried in the section where Staff Sergeant Webb walks every Saturday. I cannot adequately express what it means to know that the people who buried my father are still present and are still paying attention. Thank you." He read it back once. He sent it. Captain Barnes read the letter on Monday morning after reviewing the old guard's incident report and watching the footage and speaking with Webb. He had read hundreds of letters from military families in his career, letters of thanks and letters of complaint and letters that were both, and he had developed the specific capacity to read in a letter not just what it said, but what the person writing it had needed to say and what it had cost them to say it. He read Jerome Whitfield's letter, and he thought about Calvin Whitfield's service record, and about the 41 years, and about the flag, and about the fact that an officer on the same grounds where Calvin Whitfield was buried had asked Dorothy Whitfield if she knew what section she was sitting in. He wrote back that afternoon. He said, "Major Whitfield, your father's record speaks for itself. What Staff Sergeant Webb did on Saturday is what the old guard does. We will be there next Saturday and every Saturday after." Margaret Osei had not been there that Saturday. She had heard about it on Sunday from Dorothy, who had called her not to report the incident, but to tell her a thing she thought Margaret would want to know, because in 11 months of Saturday afternoons in Section 60, she had come to understand that Margaret Osei was a person who wanted to know things that mattered even when the things that mattered were difficult, and that the telling was itself a form of respect. She had told her about the salute, about the 6 soldiers, the 7 seconds, the single nod. She had told her in the same voice she told everything, direct, precise, without embellishment. She had not told her first about the question Pruitt had asked. She had told her about the salute because the salute was the thing that had stayed with her since Saturday afternoon, not the question. The question had passed through her the way questions of that type passed through her, noted, assessed, recognized for what it was, and set aside. She had been asked that type of question in various forms across 67 years, and her response to it had been the same across those years. She did not give it more weight than it deserved, which was the weight of someone's error, not the weight of something she was required to carry. The question was Pruitt's mistake. The salute was the record correcting itself. The salute was what stayed. She had told Margaret 6 soldiers, dress blues, full hand salute, 7 seconds. I gave the nod back. Margaret had listened in the way she listened to the things that were most important, completely without interjecting. She had said Dorothy. Margaret had been quiet for a moment. She had said Dorothy. Dorothy had said, "I know." They had not said anything else about it. The following Thursday, Margaret had gone to Section 60 on a day that was not her regular day. She had gone to Kwame's grave, and she had sat for a while, and she had brought yellow flowers. The flowers that Kwame had always said were too loud, the argument she was still having with him from the other side. She had looked over at Calvin Whitfield's grave 40 feet away. She had looked at the headstone. She had thought about what Dorothy had described. She had thought about 6 soldiers holding a salute in the October light in Section 60 for 7 seconds. She had thought about Dorothy's single nod, not the footage, which she had not watched, but Dorothy's description of it, which had been, "I gave him the nod back." That was all I needed to do. Margaret had sat in Section 60 for a long time. She had sat and she had looked at Kwame's headstone, and she had looked at Calvin Whitfield's headstone 40 feet away, and she had thought about the 2 women herself and Dorothy, who came to this section on their Saturdays carrying the specific weight of specific losses in the specific company of each other and of the others who came, and she had thought that the section itself was a kind of record, not just of the people buried in it, but of the people who came to it, who kept coming, who would not be asked to leave, who brought yellow flowers and white asters and thermoses of coffee and black journals and folding camp chairs and the particular sustained commitment of people who understand that what they are doing here is not optional and is not finished. She had thought that is Dorothy. She had brought 2 thermos cups the following Saturday. Dorothy had brought the thermos. The following Saturday, Dorothy Whitfield drove from Columbus to Arlington. She arrived before noon as she always did. She set up the green camp chair at Calvin's grave. She poured coffee from the thermos. She opened the journal to the page after the last entry, which was the entry she had been writing when Pruitt had approached the entry that had a small break in the middle where she had set the journal in her lap and looked at him. She finished the entry. Then she turned to the next page. She began the new entry October. Sat here for 3 hours. Finished the fig preserves for Mrs. Arma. Jerome called to check in. He sounds well. The garden is holding, though the tomatoes are done for the season. She wrote for a while. She stopped and looked at the headstone. She thought about the salute. She thought about the 7 seconds of it. The precision, the held hand, the detail behind Webb executing the same motion in unison. She thought about what it had meant to sit there and receive it without flinching. She thought about what Calvin would have said. He would have said something short. He would have said they gave you honors. She would have said they gave me a salute. He would have said that's the same thing. She would have said, I know. She thought 41 years and I can still hear you. She wrote that in the journal. At 4:15, she heard the sound of footsteps on the path. She looked up. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb was coming through Section 60 on the Saturday afternoon walk. He had the 5-member detail behind him. He was walking the perimeter as he always did at the measured pace the ceremony required. He reached the position in front of Calvin's grave. He paused. He brought himself to attention. He gave the cemetery honors salute, the formal marker salute given to the graves of veterans, and he held it for the 3 seconds that the protocol required. He gave Dorothy a nod. She gave him the same nod back. He walked on. The detail walked on behind him. The afternoon was very quiet. Dorothy Whitfield sat in the green camp chair and finished her coffee and closed the journal and looked at her husband's name on the white headstone. She thought about the previous Saturday. She thought about Pruitt and about the salute and about the 7 seconds. She thought about standing up from the chair afterward and saying what she had said, the specific information stated without heat. The record given as fact, his name, his rank, his service, his years, his decorations, their years together. She had said it because it was true, and because saying true things into the space created by an inadequate question was the correct response, and because she wanted the record to be audible and complete in that specific moment and in that specific place in Section 60, at his grave in the October afternoon, so that anyone who was in the vicinity understood what had just happened and who had just been asked if she knew where she was. She did not think about it with anger. She had thought about it all week with the specific contained quality she brought to things that had happened and that deserved to be understood rather than reacted to. She had thought he was a young officer who looked at me in that chair and decided I was someone who could be condescended to. He was wrong about what he was looking at. And then the honor guard corrected his assessment publicly without a word for 7 seconds, in the October light of this section that contains among the other 28 years of service buried in it. Calvin James Whitfield, Master Sergeant, USA. She thought the correction was more powerful than any complaint I could have filed. She thought, and it will be in the record permanently. She looked at the late afternoon light at its October angle and thought about 41 years and 28 of service, and 1 garden and a basket of figs held up to a kitchen window, and a flag in a triangular case on the mantel in Columbus, which was the same flag she had carried from the ceremony, and the same flag that sat now on the mantel in their house, the house they had bought when they came home to stay with the garden in the back that she was tending alone now 1 season at a time. She thought about what Jerome had said on the phone after the first Saturday. He had said, "Are you going back next Saturday?" And she had said, "Of course I'm going back next Saturday." And she had thought as she said it about the implicit question in his question, which was, "Is what happened enough to stop you from coming?" And the answer to the implicit question was the same as the answer to the explicit one. Of course not. Of course not. This is Calvin's grave, and she came here on Saturdays, and nothing that had happened in that cemetery or could happen in that cemetery was going to change that, because the Saturday visits were not an act of sentiment. They were an act of correct practice. The thing you did when the person who had been at the center of your life for 41 years was now at a location you could reach in 3.5 hours on a Saturday morning, and reaching it was the right thing to do. And she did what was right. She thought he is here. She thought about what that meant sitting in the chair with the October light at its angle across the headstones, and the birds in the trees and the distant sound of the cemetery's late afternoon settling into quiet. He is here. Not as a consolation. Not as a wishful reading of the grave's geography. As a fact of a different order, the fact that everything Calvin Whitfield had been was contained in this section, in this record, in this ground, and that the record did not diminish with time and could not be removed by a question asked from a position of ignorance, and that the 6 soldiers who had stood at attention in the October light had demonstrated publicly for 7 seconds that the institution knew what it contained and was prepared to account for it. The salute was the institution saying, "We know. We have always known. We will be here next Saturday, and the following Saturday, and however many Saturdays it takes." She thought that is the agreement. She thought Calvin would have understood the agreement completely. She thought, "I will be back next Saturday." She rose and folded the chair and picked up the thermos and looked at the headstone once more. She looked at it for a full, unhurried moment, the name, the rank, the dates, the branch, all of it cut into the white marble with the specific precision of a headstone at Arlington, which is manufactured and installed to a standard that reflects the seriousness with which the institution treats the act of marking a grave. She had stood in front of this headstone for the first time on the day of the burial, when the ceremony was over and the last of the guests had moved toward the cars, and Jerome was beside her, and she had looked at the marble and read the name, and thought with the clarity that extreme grief occasionally produces. This is the most accurate sentence in the world. Whitfield Calvin James. That was the truest thing. Nothing had been subtracted and nothing had been added. She had stood in front of it 11 times since then. Today was the 12th. She said quietly, "See you next week." She walked toward the exit. The cemetery was very still in the late October afternoon. The trees along the central path beginning to turn the light low and clean and specific, arriving at the angle that October light arrives in this latitude sideways with the warmth of late afternoon, filtered through the turning leaves, giving everything on the paths and between the headstones a quality of illumination that was not dramatic but was complete, the kind of light that makes what it touches visible in all of its actual character, rather than simplified by the brightness or shadow that other light produces. She walked through it the way she had walked through everything in her life that required walking through with the contained, purposeful movement of someone who knows exactly where they are and where they are going and what they left behind them and who carries all of it without it slowing her down. She was 67 years old. She had grown up with the flag case on her grandmother's mantel and an uncle who came home from Vietnam, not quite the same, and a grandfather who had served in Korea and not spoken about it to her, but whose silence she had learned to read. She had married a soldier at 22 and spent the next 41 years in the specific life that marriage produced, the moves and the deployments and the post-communities and the weight of the work that her husband carried home in the evenings and that she helped him set down without requiring him to explain it. She had built a 32-year career as a school librarian, which was not the largest career or the most visible one, but was the one that had put her in proximity to knowledge and to the particular kind of relationship between people and language that libraries enable, and she had done it with the same attention she brought to everything else. She had lost Calvin 11 months ago. She came back here every Saturday because coming here was the correct thing to do, and she intended to keep doing it for as long as it continued to be the correct thing to do. No one was going to tell her she did not know what section she was sitting in. The record knew. The record had always known. It was in Calvin's headstone, and in the Arlington visitor log, and in the 53-second footage that 2.7 million people had watched, and in the old Guard's incident report, and in the Army's public statement, and in Jerome's letter to Captain Barnes, and in Margaret Osie's extra thermos cup on the following Saturday. The record was in all of those places, and it was also in the single-contained nod Dorothy Whitfield gave to Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb on a Saturday afternoon in October, which was the specific response of someone who understood exactly what was being offered and who received it with the full dignity that it was given with. The 6 soldiers who walked Section 60 on Saturday afternoons knew what they had done and why they had done it. And the salute they had given her in the October light was the record made visible, the 28 years and the Bronze Star and the 2 Iraq tours and the Panama deployment and the Gulf War and the fig tree in the backyard in Columbus and the 41 years and the flag in the triangular case, all of it standing at attention for 7 seconds in the afternoon light of Section 60, because that is what the record does when it is called upon to speak. It speaks. It speaks with precision and with the full weight of what it contains, and it does not require the person it is speaking to explain themselves to anyone. She already knows what section she is sitting in. She has known for 41 years. She carries all of it. The cemetery is very still in the late October afternoon. The trees are turning the oaks along the central path beginning to go red at the edges. The maples already fully changed the light, moving through all of it at the low angle that October afternoon light uses in this latitude, which gives everything it touches a specific quality of clarity. The paths are quiet. The headstones catch the light and give it back. The flags that mark certain graves in the section move slightly in the late afternoon air. The cemetery makes the sound that large outdoor spaces make in the late afternoon, the sound of almost nothing, which contains within it everything. In Section 60, at one of the graves in the middle rows, white asters are set against the base of a white marble headstone, pressed firmly into the soil at the stone's base by the hands of the woman who placed them and who will place different ones next Saturday, and the Saturday after, and the Saturday after that. She will be back next Saturday, and the Saturday after that, and the Saturday after that. For as long as there are Saturdays and a green camp chair and a thermos of coffee and a black journal and white asters or yellow ones or whatever the season offers, she will be back. She already knows what section she is sitting in. She has always known. The record has always known. Now everyone knows. This is what the record does.